Let us continue our discussion of what was happening in the US, but I will add some details of what was happening outside the world as well in terms of the politics of climate change. Here is a headline: the conference adopts Kyoto Protocol. That's in the Japan Times. What is the conference? There is a meeting of all the countries in the world somewhere every year, and they together decide what they want to do, and that's called the Conference of the Parties, or COP. Now every year there is a COP, but some of them are big. So this in 2015, the Conference of the Countries of the Parties to Climate Agreement under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change agreed to take on the Kyoto Protocol, and then countries have to sign up if they want, and then they have to do a process called ratification. So president of a country simply cannot go and put his signature on some agreement outside the country without getting permission from his government to do that. We mentioned the Congress of the United States before. Congress in the US, there is a Senate and there is a Congress together. They are called the Congress. The House and Senate. So together they are called the Congress, and they have to approve these sorts of things. Excuse me. It is very hot here, children. It's really hot. In reality, however, a little changed. Lowering the release of the greenhouse gases was trickier than fixing the ozone layer. As we said, the Keeling curve shows that the CO2 keeps going up, and the other greenhouse gases like methane and N2O also continue to go up. So the United States Senate actually never ratified the agreement as to the time when this book was written, but we will see that more recently it was ratified because it depends on which party is controlling the White House where the president sits, and which party is controlling the House and the Senate, and whether they all agree to this agreement at the international level or they do not. So ratification means a country says, yes, we are going to do this. In the United States, many businesses, ones that made billions of dollars, counted on people to keep using fossil fuel. Oh God, my throat is suddenly dry. Sorry about that. So these companies that made billions of dollars in profit counted on people to keep using fossil fuel energy. For example, oil companies, car manufacturers, and coal producers. If there were limits on releasing greenhouse gases, their businesses would suffer. People would be laid off from their jobs. In the United States, certain groups within the Republican Party were on the side of these big businesses instead of what the people wanted. So some politicians backed away from setting rules for company emissions. They said it was more important for people to keep their jobs and have the economy continue to grow and compete with other countries like China and India and so on. Soon, people were taking sides along party lines. Democrats said, yes, let's agree on Paris Agreement and climate action. Republicans said, no, it's not necessary and it's not a big deal and it's not a reality. Ideas on climate change began to divide the country. By and large, Democrats were in favor of tougher laws to protect the environment, while the Republicans were against more regulation. In 2001, Republican President George W. Bush formally pulled the United States out of the Kyoto Protocol. He said, we don't want to remain on this international agreement anymore. He claimed it would hurt the economy. Without the United States, one of the biggest energy users in the world and the richest country with a lot of influence, the Kyoto Protocol fell apart, and in fact It officially ended in 2012 and it was considered a failure. Okay, that's where this book ends, but let's continue and see what happened after that. So the countries of under the UNFCCC decided they will continue to negotiate and they came up with the Paris Agreement in 2015, which gave the countries a different way of participating in the climate action. It asked the countries to submit their own plans on how they were going to reduce their own emissions, and every country presented a nationally determined contribution or NDC of its own in a democratic way. India said something, China said something, and many countries across the world presented a plan to say we will reduce emissions in this way by increasing renewables, by growing more forests and building better cars and so on and so forth, right? We looked at the timeline of the climate change. Let me run through that again quickly. 1896, you remember Svante Arrhenius already argued for carbon dioxide impacts. In 1920 to 25, era of large-scale petroleum development began, and not just Persian Gulf but even Texas in the US. 1930s, Milutin Milankovitch publishes Mathematical Climatology and Astronomical Theory of Climate Change to explain causes of Earth's climate change, Earth's ice ages. Roger Revelle, we talked about this, and 1960, the curve developed by American climate scientist Charles David Keeling, which is shown here, which has become an iconic figure now that we looked at many times already, started showing that the CO2 was going up and up and up. And we had the first oil shock in 1973, well before you were born, maybe even before your parents were born, where there was a crisis in the Middle East which perturbed the oil supply to all the countries. We're living happily with big cars and so on, assuming the oil will keep flowing, and there was a major crisis. But 1974, the first evidence of chlorine chemicals being involved in the ozone depletion was published by a few scientists. Second oil shock happened in 1979. In 1980, Keeling curve concentration showed that we had jumped to 337 ppm, which shocked many people but not everybody. Oil companies of course said it's not a big deal. 1990, first governmental panel on climate change, the IPCC that I mentioned, produced a report noting the pattern of warming and said the future warming is likely. So they used the models with some future scenarios of emissions to say where we are headed, and that it was not good news. 1992, United Nations conference in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil created the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that I mentioned. Kyoto Protocol was created, and the Keeling curve showed now 367 ppm by 2000 and so on. And the role of carbon dioxide also started to appear in other things like the acidification of the ocean. What does that mean? If you dissolve CO2 into water, it becomes carbonic acid. So things that are acidic have a lower pH than things that are basic. You can go and see which are the basic things in your refrigerator and the acidic things in your refrigerator. Where does water belong? Where does milk belong? And so on and so forth. So as of 2022, this is a map of countries that had ratified the Paris Agreement. So here are some that signed 195 countries. Ratification happened in 193 countries, and some countries didn't ratify or sign. So US ratified but then was pulled out by George W. Bush, but now it says it's back in because President Joe Biden, the current president, is from the Democratic Party, and he said we must do something about climate change, so we are back in. Okay, so this is the story and the timeline. We'll come back and talk about what are the environmental policies doing, and if people in every country is concerned about climate change, if there are countries where people think it's not something we need to worry about, right? So it's a lot of information online that you can keep finding and learning more, but you have to also study for school. So make sure you set aside time properly and get some adult guidance before you start listening to podcasts like this on YouTube. There is adult supervision needed if you are very young, but if you're old enough, maybe teacher asked you to see these and learn more and so on. So you decide and come back and see me in the next podcast on